Here's the opening slide. Like I said before, taking this and really kind of looking at it as a larger approach for the entire period. So what is that? So what are we looking at? I think very good idea was that Dr. Torget asked me and everyone else that was doing this, let's start with a big question. And so I thought about, how can I pull some of this together? And so the question I'm going to kind of start with and come back to is, how did Texas progressives seek to educate the public on issues of science and health? And so over and over again, we're going to come back to kind of what's going on there with science and health and how is that going? First of all, we have to say, all right, what era are we talking about? Early 20th century, that could mean a lot of things. And I'm going to really talk about it as the progressive era, which is a cliche, to be honest with you, but it's something that's used over and over again. So it's the term we often use. And it can mean a lot of things, but I'm going to tell you what those are. But first, some people say the progressive era could be the Gilded Age of progressive era. So it's basically the end of Reconstruction till about 1920. Some people, so that'd be about 1877. Some say, no, it's closer to the early 20th century. So 1890 or so to the beginning of World War I or 1920. Some historians, especially in Texas, talk about this being, hold on, this is gonna bother you. Oh, I guess I can't fix it. Being, maybe that early, late 19th century, all the way to maybe 1930, partially because we see types of issues and even some progressive reform going on that continues well beyond 1920 into the 1920s. The era gets its name, though, from the reformers from this period that are often called the progressives. And today I'm going to focus really about 1900 to 1920. Really, I'm going to focus about 1900 through the start of World War I. So about 1917, 1918. I give you some examples. Now, the events and trends that shape this era, there's so many. But I kept coming back to this idea of the early 20th century and the age of oil. So what does oil do? What's going on with oil? It's technology, industry, urbanization that goes along with industry, science. How does that kind of theme work into other things? And so some of the events that shape this and trends that shape this era are enormous increased urbanization, which I'll show you in a minute. Some of those numbers, increased use of drilling of oil, also increased industry. And for example, the big one with people talking about Spindletop in 1901, but also beyond that, that's kind of a beginning more than that is a culmination. Enormous increased access and focus on science and related health. That some of that is built on germ theory that was developed in the late 1800s, and people then taking that information into their everyday life. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And also, increased transportation, increased communication. So, for example, trains and train tracks, later 19th century, exponentially grow throughout Texas during this period. And I believe someone has spoke about that in an earlier lecture with transportation and railroads and I believe cattle industry as well. So you've got an idea of that. But that means that you can move people and you can move ideas and you can move goods and you can move services, but especially for this particular discussion that we're going to have today, moving people and ideas, and also the communication. So you start with telegraph and by the end of this era, you get access to telephone. Same thing with transportation. You start with things like water travel and railroads. And then also by the end of this era, we have the introduction of automobiles. And so we see a lot more ideas and people moving. Oops, sorry about that. Going back to urbanization, this is actually a very important part of what I'm going to talk about today. Texas urbanization during this era is huge. It explodes. It explodes. 1880, you'll see here's the top 5 cities, with Galveston being the largest at just over 22,000. By 1900, Galveston's already moving down the scale, but it's almost twice that size already. And then San Antonio's coming in at over 53,000. And then by 1920, 1/3 of Texans are already living in, and I know the word metropolitan for 2,500 people is kind of questionable, but what we're saying is when you get 2,500 people living in a city or a town, in that case, that'd be a township, you have services and you have the existence of certain industry and exchange that you wouldn't have otherwise. It turns a place to be at least leaning more towards urban, and a third of Texas at that point is already living in those areas. And San Antonio is coming at the largest city at 161,000 or over that. The lower of the five largest cities, El Paso, it's over 77,000, almost 77,500, is, you know, significantly larger than the largest city was 20 years before with San Antonio. And so we see this huge explosion for urbanization. And what that does is that it, you know, it brings these factors together, and that's going to influence, you know, industrial growth. And so urbanization is going to help industrial growth, and then industrial growth is also going to feed urbanization. But also it means that people are in a much more close proximity to one another. And this can bring like-minded individuals who have similar interests together more often so that they can form groups to discuss some of these interests, which is what we're going to talk about today. But also this close proximity of thousands, and soon by the end of this era, hundreds of thousands of people producing and consuming goods, producing and services, but also sharing those same locations also produce waste, and it also means a competition over consuming resources. So you have this new exchange, and it's exponentially growing over a couple of decades, and it makes an enormous amount of difference to lifestyle. So actually, I want to do something with that really, really quickly. And part of that close proximity is also not only people coming in close proximity with one another, but large groups of people in these cities coming in connection to close proximity to industrial production. And I'm going to give an example of this, and it's actually oil related. So for an example, in 1901, when Spindletop is first tapped successfully, it immediately started to produce this unbelievable amount of oil at about 75,000 to 100,000 barrels a day. And the thing about it is that it took a few weeks for them to cap it off, which means you have oil at that rate just flowing into the air and flowing onto the ground. And one of the things that happened fairly soon while this was going on, you had these huge lakes of crude oil that's just sitting around. And during the 9 days before the well could be capped, so well over a week, a passing train came by. So see, you can see industry here, you can see oil production, you can see the transportation, you know, all of this going on. And it set fire to some of these lakes of crude oil. And this enormous amounts of black tar-like smoke started going into the air. Well, Spindletop is right next to, and I'm going to pull this up, hang on. Spindletop is right next to Beaumont. And so I'm pulling, I hope you all can see a map. I brought up a Google Earth, thank you. I got a feedback, I guess. And so you can see here's the Spindletop oil field section. This is a current satellite image. So about, you know, in the last couple of years. And then you see the city of Beaumont right there, okay? So people are living right up against where all of this crude oil is coming out, where it's all being no, it's not being anything yet because it hadn't been capped. So it's all coming out and it's all accumulating. And this train comes by and it sets fire to this massive pool of oil. And with all of this smoke, guess where it's going to go? A lot of it's going to waft over to the city of Beaumont. And on top of that, not only is it now filling the air in the city of Beaumont, that it began to rain. And the rain brought these chemicals down out of the sky, out of the clouds, and onto people's houses, onto the ground, onto people. And so it covered the houses in this slimy pollution. And so this close proximity with all this growth, all these things that are happening, you know, cause this issue. And it's a really good kind of project to bring students when we're talking about these issues during this period, to show them these things on the map. One of the things I love about this particular one, though, is that there's kind of a, what you could call a dial back machine with Google Earth. And so I can pull this satellite image back all the way to 1938, which isn't quite 1901, but it gives you a really good view of where the Spindletop oil area is, and then where's the city of Beaumont, and about where the growth had happened by that point. But also, I'm going to pull this in a little bit. So this image, it looks like, see, you'll notice here it says image 2021. So this is really recent. I'm going to pull us down to this area for the Spindletop oil field. And you'll notice these lakes and how dark black everything is, because the ground is still just soaked with this crude oil. And you can see, you know, what could that mean? What could happen? And like I said, this is a 2021 image. And so this could create all sorts of conversations about what kind of health issues could go along with this. What does this mean for building? What does this mean for land use? And it's a really, you know, dramatic example. And while the Spindletop example, you know, it's an extreme example of, you know, what some of this close proximity could do to some of the growth and what's going on during this period. It's not really the only thing that's going on, and it's not what's happening all over the state. And so I want to give you a couple of local examples, but that are happening and have the tendency to occur in a lot of the urban areas, and a lot of other places throughout Texas. And that's when we really kind of start talking about, you know, what's going on during this period, and who's, you know, what the area is often named after, and what are they doing. There are individuals that are looking to reform their surroundings all over the state, all over the United States, transnationally, actually, during this period. And, you know, obviously looking around at problems, for example, like this close proximity to industry and what that means. What kind of health issues could come out of that? There isn't regulation at that point for the oil industry. There will be. But they're looking to kind of figure out what are some of the models and some of the systems that can go into determining how to make their environments healthier, or how to get information out to help people be healthier, and what they want also out of their local communities. And often when we talk about that, as I said earlier, we discuss individuals called progressives. And so these progressives are often referred to as reformers for this period. And most progressives had a series of shared traits in common. And I want you to keep these in mind. And I also want you to keep in mind some of the types of ways that they look at the way that their reform plays itself out, because we're going to bring that up when we look at our primary source at the end. First of all, often, almost always actually, one of the things that progressive reformers have in common is a certain level of optimism. They have to believe that change is possible. They have to invest in and look at, you know, the fact that not only change is possible, but their ideas are what are going to bring about something that's positive. It's not always the case that it's positive for everyone, but the individuals or their groups are very much optimistic about the possibility of the future and what they could do and how they could reform certain whatever they're focusing on, which we'll talk about. They're often invested in this idea newer is better. That's really important. They really focus on modernism or modernity. They're very focused, and that's often comes along with science, scientific discovery. Not always, not even universally, but at all. But science is a big push for a lot of progressive reformers. And they're going to take at least their general knowledge about certain scientific ideas, and they're going to try to apply those to everyday life. And so newer is better, or, you know, more advanced, more up to date, more modern. Very often we see progressives looking at it that way. Progressive reformers, they're reformers looking for answers to problems. What problems? Well, whatever problems they think are more important. And, you know, they're very much invested in kind of finding answers to these. And again, like I said earlier, you know, this idea of science, or also experts. They very much like expertise. and how are those experts determined? Often more and more throughout that era, we're going to look at certification, university degrees, college education. This kinds of things are going to come into this perspective. One of the major things that progressives do is that they'll work with as part of a group or an organization or association, often called associationalism, which we're going to talk a lot about today. What that means is they get a bunch of like-minded individuals, or they get together with a bunch of like-minded individuals, and as a group, they act on behalf of the group. And so a club or an organization, has a lot more voice if you have a number of individuals. Well, what also happened during that period was not just one local group in Galveston or one local group in Corpus Christi or one local group in Dallas or Austin or wherever, Paris, Texas, wherever, Lubbock, El Paso, Laredo, wherever, that these groups also form together in larger state level associations, which will often connect to larger national associations. And part of that is that they're exchanging information back and forth, that groups in other states will exchange through the National Association with the groups in Texas, and then this large Texas association, whatever it is, will then feed information down to their local organizations that are affiliates, and those affiliates will send information back up, and you have this communication exchange. And it gives people an opportunity to see what other people are doing elsewhere that's working, what's not working, but it also means larger numbers to affect change. But often, but not always, I think it's very important that we say not always, progressives or middle-class reformers. Part of the reason for that is that means that they have access to some financial ability to fund their reform, but also middle-class individuals are more likely than labor class individuals to have more spare time on their hands, and also more likely to have more influence in connection to personal connections or networks with individuals like city council members or state legislators or office holders in that kind of way, but also in connection to universities and access to information in that way. And so we see that it's not always that progressives are middle class, but very often a lot of the ones that we look at and study are because they fit this model or this mold. It's very important to point out, although I'm not going to talk too much about this today, that progressivism did not mean equality or egalitarianism. And so you don't see that kind of direction always with progressivism. It can progress, that some of the progressive reform could be pushing towards that, but it didn't always mean that. Okay. So one of the things that we're really going to talk about today is these associations, associationalism, that most often progressives sought answers and reforms through associations, and then through public appeal, through government lobbying, or a mixture of all of these. And so they're forming these clubs and these groups. Here are some, I'm not going to talk about all these today. I just wanted to give you some examples of who I mean. Here's some of the associations or progressive era organizations. Some state level, many of them are state level here, and these are proper nouns if they're capitalized. So these aren't words I'm using to describe anything. These are proper nouns. They were used exactly like this at the time. And you'll notice, and I did this on purpose just to show you how some of those are starting up as early as the 1880s. So again, this is not a 1900 to 1920 conversation. It's just some examples of some of the organizations that were in Texas at the time. And a couple of these we will talk about. Now, let's get down to some stories and some examples so we can really apply and kind of understand. So I'm going to use an organization out of Corpus Christi as kind of a case study to discuss some of this and kind of apply it in larger ways. So the Texas Federation of Women's Clubs was the Texas affiliate to the national organization called the General Federation of Women's Clubs. The Texas Federation of Women's Clubs formed in the 1890s. And it had local clubs and organizations that were members. And one of these was the Women's Monday Club in Corpus Christi. The Women's Monday Club formed shortly, or around the same time as the Texas Federation of Women's Clubs forms. The Women's Monday Club formed in 1897 and originally was a reading group where local, and very important, these descriptions are white, middle class, and they'll soon become reformers. will get together every week and they'll do a study lessons, and people would read quotes. And early on, they're doing things like they're studying Shakespeare, and they'll continue to do that throughout their life for decades after. But they're going to add, by around 1900, they're going to add new reform measures where they're getting involved in city reform endeavors. And this is very similar to what the Texas Federation is doing, and it's very similar to what the General Federation of Women's Clubs at the national level is doing. Some examples of this that go along with some of these science and health that I wanted to discuss with you. First of all, so Corpus Christi, I'm gonna bring this map up again. Somebody give me a thumbs up if you can see this. Oops, actually I'm gonna go, sorry, I have too many screens going on at once. I'm gonna do this so that, oh, thank you, Eric. I'm going to go to Corpus and Google Earth really quickly, Corpus Christi, so I can show you its surroundings, but I did it before I brought it up on screen because people can get kind of woozy and nauseous. So you'll see where Corpus Christi is. It's right on the coast. If you don't know that, I'm sure everyone does. But it's a coastal city, and this is important to this, you know, to some of the stories I'm going to talk about. So when this local club, the Women's Monday Club, and many of the progressive organizations around Texas would operate similarly to this, they were studying different themes. They soon started not just studying things like Julius Caesar or Shakespeare, but they'd start studying themes that were going along with urbanization or what was happening around them, and history, and different kinds of lessons that were going along with what other clubs, other places were doing. And they started studying around 1902, 1903, 1904, urban reform and different ways that groups of progressives were coming together to discuss how to clean up what they thought, you know, looked at as clean up their city, often called city beautification, you know, adding parks to their areas, which is sometimes city beautification, but it's often called the parks movement, and what was going on in different places. And one of the things that the Women's Monday Club started to look into was illness that was caused by mosquitoes. And mosquitoes along the coast, if you all have ever been down there, can be really, really bad. Not just there, but Wisconsin, for example, has some of the worst mosquitoes in the United States. It's not coastal, but it's because of the many areas. And so you have this idea that, you know, mosquitoes are causing disease, and Corpus Christi had a long history of this. And so about the same time, and it's related to this, the city council in Corpus Christi started looking at ways to get, you know, to help eradicate mosquito problems. And the Women's Monday Club approaches them and offers, you know, assistance in this, and said, you know, we really don't know how you all will be able to go about this, but they had passed some regulations about covering water and not having standing water because mosquitoes breed in that. And the Women's Monday Club members and other actually Texas Federation of Women's Clubs organizations in Corpus Christi, there were others besides the Women's Monday Club at this point, volunteer to kind of go around and looking at people's yards and looking through their fences and you know, and reporting to the homeowners or reporting to the business owners, but also reporting to the city council when they find the city ordinance being broken. And, you know, there's no record of how local Corpus Christians or Corpus Christi residents reacted to having these groups of women running around and looking at it and reporting them and coming up to them. I really wish there were, because I have a feeling that while the sentiment's very good and the health and creating healthier environments is a good idea, that it wasn't always completely appreciated in the way I think that these women would have expected. But you see that they're kind of self-appointing themselves as an answer to this problem. And we're going to see models like this happen in multiple places all over the state. Another example with this organization, though, a few years later, went along with a national and state level endeavor that many of you probably talk about either in your US history classes, but already also in your Texas history classes, which is the Pure Food and Drug laws that were passed. At the United States level, the General Federation, the national organization I was talking about, had worked and lobbied along with many, many other groups to get the federal Pure Food and Drug Acts passed in 1906. And, Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, for example, published around that time, was arguing for these kinds of things and for Pure Food Acts. And so, well, actually, he was a labor reformer, but it ended up making people very supportive of pure food after they read the book and what was going on in these factories. Well, all of that information is being passed around. And an example of that, many examples are happening like that in Texas. So the Texas Federation of Women's Clubs in 1907 starts having local, looking around at what's going on in the local areas, and they had been, and they realized in 1906 and 1907 there was no Texas pure food and drug endeavors through legislation. And so by 1907, the Texas Federation and all of its local affiliates get together and they lobby very successfully for pure food and drug. Actually, for that, it was much more focused on dairy and pure food, but legislation passed. And the Texas legislature creates a position for dairy and food commissioner. And it provides this one human being. So remember, 254, well, at that point, we're not quite 254 counties, but close. About 250 counties, statewide, one person and a stenographer. That's all. That's what it allowed for, and a $5,000 budget, which is a lot of money at that point, but not that much. And so the question became, how did this commissioner and also progressives like those that were connected to the Texas Federation of Women's Clubs, how did they support this? And one of the things that they did was that members of these Texas Federation clubs, like the Women's Monday Club in Corpus Christi, volunteered to be trained and become deputized inspectors, assistant inspectors kind of thing. And they would go around and they would go to factories and they would go to all sorts of dairy producers and inspect and provide information, not only to the food commissioner, but in different situations also to the public. An example of that with the Women's Monday Club in Corpus was that they went and they inspected local bakeries. And so again, going back to Corpus Christi, I'm going to remove this screen. Hopefully you all can see this slide again. You can see, or you could see by the map I showed you that Corpus Christi is a coastal city. It's a very tropic environment. And there were bugs and mosquitoes, and Corpus is extremely windy, and dirt in the air and pollution and all these things. And these bakeries don't have any screens on their windows. And so they have bread just sitting out rising with all these windows open, and all sorts of things are blowing into the dough and getting into the mixture, and goodness knows what you were going to find. And so one of the big push was to get screens put on their windows to keep some of the outside objects and pollution and insects and all of that, out of the bread. And they would go around and they would see if a baker, had screens on their windows, and if they didn't, they would push them to do it. And they would inform the food inspector, but they also would run articles in the local Corpus Christi Caller-Times informing people which bakers did and did not have screens on their windows. Where could you and could you not find, for another example, milk that was kept properly and that hadn't been, had water added to it or other additives to make it stretch further to be able to sell more, right? Which meat market individuals were not leaving their meat out at night in order to be able to have rats and other things, eat off of it before they cut off and sell the next day. All of these things were happening. And so these women are going around and looking at these areas and pushing towards these changes, which is great And they're also, but it's also, you know, we have to remember who gets access to this information, you know, who was and was not making these changes. Other things that they were also doing, and this is very important to this next part of what we're going to do, is that they would give talks and they would study preservation and, you know, long-term food preservation. Well, these kinds of things are going around statewide. It's really starting around early 1903, 1904, 1905, 1906, and they're going to continue for well over a decade, okay? And they're going to happen all over the place. Well, this is passing along information to the public, where to buy, what to do, but it's also passing along information when they're giving lectures or they're writing articles about how to properly preserve food, how to properly cook food, how to properly keep food, so that you don't make individuals sick. And that becomes, you know, it's very important for that to happen. And then, but within around 10 years or so, we start seeing it become even a larger scale. And the mobilization and the education campaigns become a larger scale because World War I is going to happen. And so the US gets involved, as you all know. The World War I starts a number of years before the US gets involved. The US gets involved and declares war in 1917. This is smack in the middle of the Progressive Era. All of these things going on. And one of the things that was very, very important to this war mobilization and getting ready for all of this was food preservation. Because you're now talking about having to provide financial sources and goods and services, not only to individuals living here in Texas or here in the United States, but also abroad in Europe, and also for the troops and those support services that are traveling with troops as they go across and as they live there and as the war is being fought. And so one of the things about that was the idea that the more that people could produce at home and the more that they could produce themselves and victory gardens and all of this, the less they would have to buy and consume that was being industrial produced, because that could just be sent over as far as the war effort. But the thing about that was that people needed to preserve those goods and that food. And while some foods can be, you know, fairly easily preserved, others require specialized equipment, but also specialized knowledge. And gathering this information, giving small public lectures, doing this thing, these are things that progressives in the States had been in the United States, but in Texas, we've talked about Texas examples, have been doing for over a decade. And so we start seeing a lot of different kinds of progressive reform overlap. Another type of progressive reform that overlapped with that was this kind of scientific food preservation, this kind of scientific housekeeping is what it was often called, the scientific domestic, you all might know the term home economics, right? Had started to be taught at the university levels a few years before, depending on the university or college in the areas, around 1911, 12, 13, 14. So you're seeing like right leading up to. And so more and more of that's being taught at university, more to, you know, and experts are being trained and receiving degrees in this, and then being sent out into local communities, either as educators or in other avenues. We're going to talk about one of those as far as your primary source is concerned. And that overlapped with how universities often provided information to local areas through extension services and educating at the county level and sending people out to do education and talks and demonstrations. And so all these three things come together, this knowledge about preserving food, this knowledge about how you kept food safe, this knowledge about what was the science behind it all, but also how to do it and what kind of equipment is needed to do it. And then also who's taught to do these things all came together. And you start seeing these extension services during World War I, which were teaching and demonstrating all sorts of things to local areas, start reaching out and also doing it in connection to food preservation. And so, we see this higher ed, universities and colleges on the ground level doing these things and reaching out and providing this information in different counties, different locations. Um, and there's something else that's very important to that, and I want to discuss, is the equipment. So we don't think of the canning and we don't think of pressure cookers as being very high tech, but they're not now, but they were, and they were unusual. People couldn't afford them very often. And so what you'd also see with these extension educators that going out into the public, going out into the counties, providing different types of information, but in this particular case, demonstrations on how to scientifically preserve food, was that they were taking equipment with them. And that equipment could be used in these demonstrations. So people from all over whatever area there was could come over and they could use some of the equipment, like the pressure cookers or whatever, to preserve their own food. And they'd have these workshops. And so you might not need to own your own pressure cooker. You might need to not own your own large boilers, and this kind of thing that could handle all of this. If you could bring all of your things on a certain day and get together and get that information. I also want to mention, while the Women's Monday Club was a white and segregated organization, these agricultural extension services were not. They were segregated, but you did have African-American extension agents going out into these areas who were trained at the college level and who were trained in doing this outreach as well. And so for African-American communities, and then there were white extension agents who were going out in for the white community. So you do have a segregation to it, but it isn't completely just available to white Texans. And, all of this kind of culminates into one of the ways that we see this war effort. And so there's this big push through, all this communication back and forth to plant your own gardens. Well, then what do you do with that? What do you do with that food? You can't just live off of that food for a couple of months, or what's going on. How do you keep it? And how do you long-term keep it? And getting that information out there.